You are listening to The Opium Wars, Britain's Wars in China. Part 1, Foreign Mud, written and narrated by Mark Felton. This episode is audio only. One hot and humid summer's evening in 2010, I was attending a function at the Seed Cathedral, Britain's extraordinary contribution to the Shanghai World Expo. The vast expo site was crowded with hundreds of thousands of people, all enjoying the fascinating exhibits in the air of international friendship and cooperation. A large Union Jack flew proudly above Britain's landmark building, itself an award-winning and dazzling profusion of light and colour. The special guests then marched in. To everyone's amazement, in came the band of the Royal Marines, immaculately turned out in white tropical service tunics, medals proudly pinned to their chests. It was not lost on me the significance of this event. For the first time since 1949, uniformed British soldiers stood under their own flag on communist Chinese soil. The Royal Marines, probably more than any other British military unit, had played an integral role in Britain's military campaigns in China, from the First Opium War in 1839 to the Yangtze Incident in 1949. I wondered, as I stood listening to the music, whether the other guests realized how significant a moment this was in Anglo-Chinese relations. Such a thing would have been unthinkable even 10 years before. And I wondered how many guests considered the enormous impact that had been made on modern China by not just the Royal Marines, but by the Royal Navy and the British Army. Shanghai itself was a product of British military adventurism, and it seemed rather poetic to me that it should have been the Royal Marines, whose unofficial motto is "the first to land," were representing Britain before the Chinese public one last time. Britain's involvement with China is truly epic. We launched huge naval and military campaigns on 3 occasions during the 19th and early 20th centuries. We invaded Tibet. We patrolled China's rivers for over 4 decades, fought a glorious last stand battle in Hong Kong in 1941, helped China to fight Japanese aggression, and got caught up in the Chinese Civil War. We gave millions of Chinese a fresh start in Hong Kong while defending the territory during the Cold War. And we fought the Chinese in set-piece battles in Korea in the 1950s. For over 150 years, Britain maintained a military presence in China, in both peace and war, and millions of British service personnel passed through their barracks, cantonments, and campaigns. The bones of many of these soldiers and sailors lie buried today beneath Chinese soil. As I listened to the Royal Marines playing God Save the Queen at the Shanghai Expo in 2010, I couldn't help but wonder how it came about that Britain became a military force in China. It is an incredible story that began with an illicit drugs trade in 1839 and ended with the skyscrapers and financial markets of Hong Kong in 1997. The first shots in Britain's most infamous conflict, the First Opium War, were not fired by a British warship at the Chinese, but somewhat ironically by a Royal Navy warship at a British merchant vessel. On the 27th of October 1839, a British merchant ship named Royal Saxon attempted to run a Royal Navy blockade into what was then Britain's biggest trading post in China, Canton, now Guangzhou, located nearly 100 miles up the Pearl River in the south of the country. HMS Volage, a fully rigged frigate, fired a warning shot across Royal Saxon's bows, a shot that was to bring out a large Chinese fleet under orders to protect the British merchantmen. That this confused situation even occurred had its roots in a pernicious drug that the British were then in the process of foisting upon the Chinese, literally by the ton. The British government, in a move of breathtaking immorality, launched the nation into a war against China to protect ruthless drug traffickers, and in so doing ushered in over 100 years of British military activity in China and dragged China unwillingly from feudalism into the modern world. The Opium Wars are generally agreed by historians to have been one of the less proud chapters in the history of Britain's ascent to great imperial power. For the first and only time in history, One nation used narcotics to dominate another, and for good reason today the Opium Wars are remembered in China as a national humiliation. Although morally difficult to justify, Britain's success in the First Opium War would eventually lead to China becoming a modern power in her own right, and it can be argued that China's prosperity today has its roots in its forcible opening to the world economic system in the 1840s, forced by the sort of gunboat diplomacy that the British used so successfully to usher in the first globalization of trade and finance. Although Britain's relationship with China had always been firmly rooted in trade and profit, it actually began quite differently. China, a vast, underdeveloped empire and the oldest nation-state on earth, with its teeming hundreds of millions and self-satisfied contempt for all things foreign, was about to collide with a grasping, heavily armed and belligerent nation of free-trading buccaneers, busily adding ports and territories to its ever-expanding empire with a determination unmatched even by the Romans. The first ship from the British Isles had visited the South China coast in 1635. They were relative latecomers, for the Portuguese had already established a small colony at Macau a century before. Soon there were British traders in small communities at Zhoushan and Xiamen, but the most important trading town was Canton, the mouth of the mighty Pearl River. A city of over 1 million souls, it was ringed, as was the Chinese style, by a massive town wall to protect it from the depredations of pirates, and was, at the time, one of the largest cities in the world. Between 1700 and 1842, Canton dominated the China trade, and it was the British who quickly became the masters of that trade. The British and other foreigners traded in China with the permission of the seldom-seen Divine Emperor in Peking, now Beijing, under Chinese laws and at the behest of Chinese officials known collectively as mandarins. The ruling Qing dynasty, themselves foreigners from Manchuria who had seized power from the elegant Ming dynasty in 1644, held an ambivalent attitude towards overseas trade and a Confucian disdain for merchants and traders. Chinese officials believed that trade incited unrest and disorder in the empire, caused piracy, and compromised the nation's defences. In the case of the British, they were to be proved right on all of these scores. The Chinese were not particularly interested in foreign manufactures and technologies, seeing no practical use for them, and they erected high tariffs and created rigid laws governing such imports, also inadvertently fostering widespread corruption among junior officials and provincial governors. The Chinese trading system with foreigners had operated for centuries on an elaborate system of tribute. The Chinese emperor was the son of heaven, mandated ruler of the entire earth, so all foreign rulers were expected to present tribute to him and acknowledge his superiority. Western nations were happy to play along, as the emperor's gifts, in order to demonstrate his munificence, were superior to the tribute given, and the emperor bestowed titles upon foreign emissaries and permitted them to trade. Trade for the foreigners was always lucrative, but by the early 19th century, European traders demanded more access to Chinese markets as their trade and wealth grew. At this juncture, the emperor tried to turn back the clock, with disastrous results. The history of China in the mid to late 19th century is of successive leaders trying vainly to close the door to the foreigners, but finding that their former guests were not averse to kicking in the door to get what they wanted. The Honourable East India Company carried out British Far East trade under royal charter. It was a vast firm with a huge private army and navy that had conquered and administered great swathes of India. There was low demand among the Chinese for European goods, but huge demand in Europe for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. The problem for the Europeans was the Chinese demand to be paid in hard currency, and the only currency that they accepted was silver. The figures were astounding. For example, from the mid-16th to the mid-19th centuries, the Chinese received 28 million kilograms of silver from Europe and America. The British especially did not like this arrangement because since the mid-18th century they had used the gold standard, and in order to purchase the required silver they were forced to purchase it from other European nations and Mexico, thereby incurring fees that lowered their profits. The East India Company first imported small quantities of the Indian narcotic opium, derisively called foreign mud by the Chinese, following the annexation of Bengal in India by Robert Clive in 1757. The company needed a product that they could trade with the Chinese in return for tea. Initially they tried European clothes, but the Chinese preferred homespun silk. Then, despite moral objections raised at the time, the British chose to fix the trade imbalance by means of Indian opium. Widespread addiction among all classes of Chinese soon reversed the flow of silver back into British coffers. The Chinese government banned the importation of opium when they realized the damage the drug was inflicting on their society, and perhaps more importantly, on their silver reserves. The East India Company circumvented the ban by establishing an elaborate trading system using both legal and illegal markets in China. British merchants would buy tea on credit at Canton. They would then buy opium at auction in Calcutta. The chests of opium would be sent on British merchant ships to the China coast, smuggled inland by local Chinese merchants, and the debts would be settled. Then, as now, the profits from drug smuggling were enormous, and the trade boomed. In 1730, the British sold 15 tons of opium in China. By 1773, this figure was up to 75 tons, and by the 1820s it had reached 900 tons annually. At the same time, the British government attempted to persuade the emperor to ease the ban on opium imports in return for certain concessions. In 1793, Earl Macartney was granted an audience with the Qianlong Emperor in the yellow-roofed Forbidden City, but he was soon politely shown the door. In 1799 and 1810, the emperor issued imperial edicts forbidding opium importation or smoking. But because of endemic corruption, the emperor was unable to effectively govern his southern provinces, and between 1821 and 1837 there was a five-fold increase in opium sales in China, vastly increasing British traders' power over the region and its population. The turning point came in 1834, when free trade reform in Britain ended the East India Company's monopoly in the Far East, ushering in hundreds of piratical and independent operators and freebooters. The Americans also began importing cheaper, lower-quality Turkish opium into China. In 1839, the 56-year-old Daoguang Emperor, who had reigned for 19 years, appointed a Manchu nobleman named Lin Zexu as governor of Canton, with orders to stop the opium trade. Commissioner Lin banned the sale of opium, ordered all opium stocks to be surrendered and destroyed, and required foreign traders to sign a no-opium bond before they could moor their ships in the city. Any foreigner found with opium in his holds was to be put to death. Lin also closed the sea channel into Canton up a myriad of tributaries and creeks off the Pearl River, in effect holding the city's British traders hostage. The man who was responsible for opening up China to foreign trade at the point of a gun was 37-year-old Royal Navy Captain Charles Elliot, British Superintendent of Trade. Elliot had joined the Navy in 1815 and had served in the East and West Indies and West Africa before being sent to Canton in 1833. Importantly, he was firmly and vocally against the opium trade, though he followed his orders to the letter. Elliot held a meeting with the angry British traders. He managed to persuade them to hand over their opium stocks to Lin, in return for the British government promising to compensate them for their losses. However, the government had no intention of honouring this agreement because it rightly feared a backlash from the British public if it became known that Her Majesty's government was protecting drug traffickers. The delighted Chinese commenced burning 20,000 chests of opium, each packed with 55 kilograms of the drug, on the 3rd of June 1839. There was so much foreign mud that it took over 20 days to destroy. Lin wrote a memorial to Queen Victoria asking her to stop the opium trade, but this letter never reached Buckingham Palace and was conveniently ignored by the hawkish Foreign Secretary Viscount Palmerston. The atmosphere all along the Chinese coast was tense during the summer of 1839. The spark that opened general hostilities between Britain and China was an incident that occurred in the small fishing village of Tsim Sha Tsui, today part of Kowloon in Hong Kong, in July 1839. At the end of June, the skipper of the British tea clipper Carnatic had been arrested by the Chinese Coast Guard in Kowloon. On the 7th of July, a large group of British and American sailors, many off the Carnatic, had gone ashore in Kowloon and discovered a supply of locally produced rice wine. Sufficiently liquored up, the mob of sailors had started a small riot in Tsim Sha Tsui, vandalized a local temple, and murdered a Chinese man. At the time, China lacked a jury trial system or evidentiary process. Britons were horrified at the medieval punishments that were dispensed by Chinese magistrates. The British government and Commissioner Elliot demanded that British subjects be granted extraterritoriality for crimes committed in China, meaning that Britons would be tried by their own consular authorities and not subjected to local justice. Commissioner Lin demanded that the sailors suspected of murder be handed over, but Elliot refused. Instead, a British court in Canton tried them, found them guilty, and transported them back to Britain, where they were promptly released. On the issue of the no opium bond that the Chinese demanded all foreign ship skippers sign, Elliot refused to agree, and instead ordered that the British withdraw from Canton and cease trading with the Chinese. In order to enforce this order, Elliot ordered 2 Royal Navy sloops, HMS Volage and Hyacinth, to lie off the Boca Tigris, a narrow channel that runs between islands in the Pearl River Delta, to prevent British ships reaching Canton. The Chinese called the channel the Humen, or Tiger Gate, and it was well named, for the Chinese had fitted the islands with claws, multiple forts well supplied with cannon. Not all of the British were drug smugglers. Some ship owners refused to allow their vessels to carry opium for religious or moral reasons, and they saw no reason why their own profits should be damaged by Elliot's drastic measures to protect the drug traffickers. These owners and captains even agreed to sign the no opium bond that the Chinese authorities demanded. On the 3rd of November 1839, the Royal Saxon, whose Quaker owners refused to take part in the opium trade, attempted to enter the Boca Tigris and make her way upriver to Canton. Elliot ordered Captain Henry Smith aboard HMS Volage to stop the ship. The Volage fired a shot across the Royal Saxon's bows. Shortly afterwards, a small fleet of Chinese war junks and other craft emerged from the mouth of the river under the command of 58-year-old Admiral Gwen Tianpei, who was later admiringly described by the British as an altogether fine specimen of a gallant soldier. The Chinese naval commander moved out to protect the Royal Saxon from further illegal interference from the Royal Navy, triggering a full-scale naval battle between Britain and the Celestial Empire. The Volage and Hyacinth, the latter a 106-foot-long 18-gun Favourite-class sloop constructed in 1829 that had previously surveyed the northeast coast of Australia, went line ahead in battle formation and opened tremendous broadsides from starboard on the Chinese vessels. Gun ports stood open as British cannons mouthed great iron balls at the Chinese ships, or loosed off grape shot that peppered the junk's sails and crew. The British ships were well armed and manoeuvrable, and they completely outclassed and outgunned Admiral Gwen's junks. The Chinese were facing the world's most technologically advanced and best disciplined navy. Its ships officered by men who had fought under Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar, or in a myriad of other battles and landings from the West Indies to the Mediterranean, from the cold North Sea to the Cape of Good Hope. The Royal Navy bestrode the globe like a massive octopus. its men of war, frigates and gunboats protecting the sea lanes for free trade, inserting military forces like projectiles onto hostile shores when required, and also mapping and exploring from Australia to the Arctic. Chinese naval warfare had scarcely evolved since the 15th century. It was the equivalent today of an F-15 supersonic jet fighter going head-to-head with a Sopwith Camel. Within minutes, one Chinese fire raft had sunk and a war junk blew up in a great cloud of fire and black smoke after a British shell tore into its magazine. It was a complete turkey shoot and a shocking display of British naval might. The action took place off Chuen-Pi Island, which was heavily defended by dug-in Chinese artillery and infantry in small forts and gun emplacements. After an initial pass with all guns blazing, the two British warships came about and made a second pass firing port broadsides. Massive clouds of gun smoke obscured the carnage as each deafening broadside did its grim work. Another huge junk blew up, 3 more sank, their hulls torn to pieces by solid shot, and several others were badly damaged and on fire. What was left of the Chinese fleet wisely retired upriver, except for Admiral Gwen's flagship, which bravely remained stationary and continued firing. Realizing that the small Chinese guns were ineffective, Captain Elliot ordered Captain Smith to cease firing, and Gwen's damaged vessel retreated to safety. HMS Volage had suffered some slight damage to her sails and rigging, and the Hyacinth's mizzenmast had been holed by a Chinese cannonball. 1 British sailor was wounded, while 15 Chinese had been killed and 4 of their war junks sunk. The Royal Saxon, the original catalyst of this ugly little battle, brazenly continued on her way to Canton, while Elliot withdrew his ships to the nearby Portuguese colony of Macau, as he knew that the Chinese would send fireboats down the river. This was the only real threat to the British wooden sailing vessels, tied as they were to the vagaries of wind and tide. The first round of the First Opium War had decisively gone to Britain. China had revealed itself to be militarily obsolete and fundamentally weak, what some were already calling the sick man of Asia. Such an easy victory only encouraged the British to press the Chinese further for the eventual goal of securing ports for their exclusive use. The 17 battles that followed were as one-sided as those of the first. The British would manage to defeat the massive Chinese Empire for the loss of just 74 men. Chinese casualties were to be conservatively estimated in the tens of thousands, and the ramifications of defeat were to be long and deep. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston began hostilities to obtain compensation for the opium smugglers whose stocks had been burned by Commissioner Lin in Canton the year before. Opinion in Britain was deeply divided concerning the morality of such a war. The future Prime Minister William Gladstone denounced the war in the House of Commons as unjust and iniquitous, adding that Palmerston was too willing to protect an infamous centralised traffic. There was also outrage in the British and American press, but regardless of public opinion, the government was determined to press ahead with its punitive campaign against China and protect the drug trade. For it saw that as well as keeping the traders happy, land could be added to the growing empire. Neil Ferguson notes in his book Empire that, quote, whenever the British were behaving despotically, there was almost always a liberal critique of that behaviour from within British society. Unquote. This is what set the British Empire apart from its European rivals, and such criticism was both consistent and loud in Britain against the Opium War, an important point that is often ignored today. The 29 British merchant ships that had evacuated Canton decided not to follow Captain Elliot's 2 warships to Macau, preferring the shelter of Hong Kong harbour, then a largely uninhabited Chinese appendage. In early 1840, Elliot asked the governor of Macau for permission for British ships to load and unload their cargoes in the Portuguese colony, offering to pay rents and duties. The governor sensibly refused, afraid that the emperor would cut off food supplies and other necessities to the enclave. Portugal had no desire to be dragged into a war with China. On the 14th of January 1840, the Emperor asked all foreigners to stop material aid to the British in China. The British government and the East India Company decided to take fast action by attacking the coast of Guangdong province, the ultimate target being the capture of its capital city, Canton. In June 1840, an expedition was outfitted in Singapore and sailed north for China. It consisted of 15 warships carrying 4,000 Royal Marines and soldiers, 4 brand new steam-powered gunboats, and 25 smaller craft. A portion of this force first struck at Chusan, now Zhoushan Island of Zhejiang Province in the middle of China on the 5th of July. In 1793, Lord Macartney had asked the Qianlong Emperor for a small unfortified island near Zhoushan for the residence of English traders, storage of goods, and outfitting of ships. The Emperor had frostily refused, so now the British decided to take it anyway, and by force if necessary. 4 British warships arrived in the anchorage of Chusan Harbour on the 4th of July. The largest vessel was HMS Wellesley, a 1,745-ton, 74-gun third-rate ship of the line, built in 1813. Aboard her was the expedition commander, Captain John Fletcher. Accompanying the Wellesley was HMS Conway, a 651-ton, 6th-rate, armed with 20 32-pounders and 6 18-pounder carronades, referring to the weight of the shells these guns fired, and 2 Athol-class 28-gun 6th-rates, the appropriately named HMS Alligator and Rattlesnake. Negotiations were attempted on the 4th of July when Captain Fletcher boarded a Chinese war junk accompanied by Viscount Jocelyn, secretary to Major General Lord Saltoun, and a Prussian missionary interpreter named Karl Gutzlaff. Fletcher delivered a written message from Commodore Sir James Bremer, 53-year-old naval commander-in-chief, and Brigadier General George Burrell, who commanded the landing troops. Bremer was to figure prominently in the coming war. A Napoleonic Wars veteran, Bremer had seen extensive service in English, Canadian, Mediterranean and East Indies waters, and had been involved in the colonization of Australia. In 1836, Bremer had been made a Knight Commander of the Royal Hanoverian Guelphic Order, and after the original naval commander in China, Rear Admiral Sir Frederick Maitland, had died, he had succeeded him to the post. Bremer alternated this position with Captain Elliot. The local Chinese governor of the Chusan Islands, Admiral Chang, was requested to surrender immediately. Quote, "If the inhabitants of the said islands do not oppose and resist our forces, it is not the intention of the British government to do injury to their persons and property." Unquote. The message further stated, "If you will not surrender, we, the Commodore and Commander, shall be obliged to use warlike measures for obtaining possession." The Royal Navy, scourge of pirates all over the world, was now applying piratical methods with shameless alacrity. After an hour of largely fruitless discussions, Admiral Chang and some local officials from the capital city, Tinghai, now Dinghai, were invited aboard HMS Wellesley. Chang and the others told Bremer and Burrell that they were extremely annoyed with being held responsible for the actions of Commissioner Lin in Canton, stating, quote, "Those are the people you should make war upon, and not upon us who have never injured you. We see your strength, and know that opposition will be madness, but we must perform our duty if we fall in doing so." Unquote. Unimpressed, Bremer gave Chang until daybreak on the 5th of July to surrender, or military action would follow. On the appointed day there was no sign of a Chinese surrender. Indeed, lookouts reported over 1,000 Chinese troops manning prepared positions on the beaches, surrounding hills and Dinghai city walls, located 1 mile from the sea. At 2 p.m., the brigs, HMS Cruiser and Algerine, moved into position off Chusan Island, and the scarlet-coated landing troops began embarking in cutters. The 1st Division consisted of the 18th Royal Irish Regiment, Royal Marines, 26th Regiment of Foot, and 2 9-pounder guns. The 2nd Division comprised the 49th Regiment of Foot, Madras sappers and miners, and a unit of Bengal volunteers. At 2:30 p.m, the Wellesley suddenly opened fire on the Chinese beach defences as the landing boats were rowed towards the shore, the 2 gun decks blasting out broadsides for 7 or 8 minutes of concentrated firing. The effect on the Chinese was devastating. After firing a few desultory shots in reply, the Chinese troops simply abandoned their positions and fled back towards the protection of the city walls. Judging by Admiral Chang's words spoken aboard the Wellesley the day before, he had probably given orders for a token defence only for the sake of his honour and his head, and wished to save his men's lives. At any rate, the British troops landed unopposed and discovered an empty beach with abandoned gun pits littered with dead bodies and discarded weapons and equipment. The British captured 91 Chinese cannon. Next, the British rolled their 2 9-pounder naval guns to within 400 yards of the Dinghai city walls, later adding another brace of 9-pounders, 2 howitzers and 2 mortars. But Bremer told the ad hoc battery to hold fire until the following day. The damage that these guns could have done to a crowded city was not lost on the Chinese. They quietly retired, and when a British reconnaissance party approached a city gate, they found it barricaded with sandbags, though undefended. There was no desire among the British to inflict unnecessary casualties on the Chinese. A company of the 49th Regiment captured the gate and hoisted the Union Jack above it. Quote, "The main street was nearly deserted, except here and there, where the frightened people were performing the kowtow as we passed," recalled Viscount Jocelyn. On most of the houses was placarded "Spare our lives," and on entering the joss houses, or temples, were seen men, women and children on their knees, burning incense to their gods. Unquote. Total British casualties amounted to 1 man wounded. On the 7th of July, the recently promoted Rear Admiral Elliot, aboard HMS Melville, issued a proclamation that stated that the Chinese on Chusan would continue to be administered under Chinese laws, with ultimate executive authority invested in the British Commander-in-Chief. Elliot appointed Brigadier General Burrell Governor and Interpreter Gutzlaff Chief Magistrate. Britain now had a safe anchorage off the Chinese mainland for the forthcoming campaign to capture Canton. Canton was located some miles up the Pearl River, the passage well protected by a series of heavily fortified islands, as well as a myriad of waterways, sandbars and other obstacles to navigation. The British were forced to conduct over a dozen operations to capture or destroy in-place Chinese forces before they could invest Canton, as well as striking at other places along the Chinese coast. One of the most invaluable weapons at the disposal of the British was the steam-driven warship, which enabled the Royal Navy to operate in Chinese rivers and to maneuver at will, free of the wind. The Chinese had not seen anything like it before, and it was truly a turning point in the history of naval warfare. The first of these operations came to be called the Battle of the Barrier, and it occurred on the boundary between Portuguese Macau and mainland China on the 19th of August 1840. A narrow, sandy isthmus separated Macau from the mainland. Facing the border and defending the eastern side of the isthmus were Chinese breastworks that contained about 1,500 troops with emplaced artillery. British warships moved into the shoal water on the eastern side of the isthmus. The Chinese had positioned 8 war junks along the western flank of the isthmus to provide covering fire. At noon on the 19th of August, Captain Henry Smith, aboard HMS Hyacinth, prepared to attack. Alongside the Hyacinth was HMS Lahn, a cutter named Louisa, and the steamboat HMS Enterprise. The vessels opened fire at the Chinese positions on shore, which promptly returned that fire, and the junks attempted to join in. Quote, "The junks which were aground in the inner harbour were utterly useless, for none of their guns could be brought to bear, though several of the 32-pound shots of the ships found their way over the bank, much to the consternation of the occupants of the junks," recalled Lieutenant John Bingham. Once the bombardment had done its work, Captain Smith ordered his landing force into action. This consisted of 110 Royal Marines, 90 armed seamen from HMS Druid, and 180 Bengal volunteers. Little fighting was encountered, and the British suffered only 4 men wounded. Between 100 and 180 Chinese were killed or injured during this short battle, and many cannon captured. The British now believed that they had some leverage with which to negotiate concessions from the Chinese, and perhaps avoid further costly naval operations. In October 1840, the Daoguang Emperor dismissed Commissioner Lin and replaced him with Qi Shan, a 54-year-old Manchu nobleman and former provincial viceroy. Lord Palmerston instructed Elliot to have the ports of Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo and Shanghai open to British trade. London also instructed Elliot to acquire the cession of an island off the Chinese coast and obtain financial compensation for destroyed opium and attendant naval and military costs. Elliot initially demanded 7 million Chinese dollars in compensation to be paid over 6 years and the surrender of Canton and Amoy as permanent British possessions. Commissioner Qi refused, offering 5 million over 12 years. The two men eventually agreed upon 6 million Chinese dollars. Qi refused, however, to countenance any territorial concessions, as the emperor would not stand for it. Elliot offered to abandon recently captured Chusan Island for another port to be decided later. Again, Qi refused. Exasperated, Elliot warned Qi directly, quote, "There are very large forces collected here," he said, referring to the large numbers of British warships and troops at the mouth of the Boca Tigris. "Delays must breed amongst them a very great impatience." Unquote. No settlement could be reached for months, as the Chinese determined not to permit a permanent British presence in their country. Rumours circulated among the foreigners that the emperor meant for war. Finally, on the 5th of January 1841, Elliot told Commodore Bremer to prepare for an attack on Canton. He informed Commissioner Qi that unless British demands were met, a general assault would be launched in 2 days' time. When no reply was forthcoming from the Chinese, Elliot gave orders for Bremer to begin the assault. At 9 a.m. on the 7th of January, a large force of British and Indian troops, 504 Royal Marines, 33 Royal Artillery, 104 men from the 26th and 49th Foot, 76 Bengal Volunteers, 607 of the 37th Madras Native Infantry, and 137 sailors landed from the warships Wellesley, Blenheim, and Melville 2 miles below the Chuen Pi batteries. In command ashore was Major Simpson Pratt, 26th Foot. The landing was unopposed by some 2,000 Chinese defenders. Accompanying the infantry force was another 30 seamen, manhandling a 24-pounder howitzer and 2 6-pounder field guns. The British force advanced 2 miles inland until they came upon a strong Chinese defensive position. 2 forts, with many dug-in cannon, surrounded by a protective ditch and breastworks. When the British approached, the Chinese soldiers started cheering and yelling, waving flags, and then opening fire with their cannon. The naval artillery had been established on a nearby hill, and the seamen opened fire on the forts, the two sides trading shot for perhaps 20 minutes. In the meantime, Bremer ordered his ships to move in and bombard the 2 Chinese forts. A squadron consisting of HMS Queen and Nemesis, under the command of Captain Edward Belcher, poured fire onto the upper fort. He would be the first person to survey Hong Kong harbour in 1841. Commanding the 2nd Squadron to bombard the lower Chinese fort was Captain Sir Thomas Herbert, a veteran of both the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 and the War of 1812 in America. Herbert's division consisted of HMS Calliope, Hyacinth, and Larne. The effect of the naval bombardment was devastating, and both Chinese forts were silenced in less than an hour. By 10 a.m., the upper fort was in British hands, while the Royal Marines stormed the lower fort at the point of the bayonet. In Anson's Bay, 15 Chinese war junks under Admiral Guen Tianpei attempted to disrupt the British operations. HMS Nemesis, a 660-ton iron paddle frigate known to the Chinese as the Devil Ship, fired a single rocket at one large junk, causing a catastrophic explosion that completely demolished the vessel. "It blew up with a terrific explosion," recalled a British witness, "launching into eternity every soul on board, and pouring forth its blaze like the mighty rush of fire from a volcano." Dismembered bodies rained down, along with masses of debris. In a short space of time, another 10 junks were destroyed by accurate British gunnery. The other junks struck their colours by about 11:30 a.m. after witnessing this horrifying spectacle. The next phase of the operation was by this stage fully underway, commanded by 50-year-old Napoleonic Wars and War of 1812 veteran Captain James Scott aboard HMS Samarang. Scott attacked Tai Kok Tau Island to the west of Chuen Pi Island, aiming to knock out the forts that were armed with 191 cannon. The forts opened fire at 10:20. The Samarang manoeuvred to a position just 200 yards from the main fort, dropped anchor, and proceeded to unleash repeated deadly broadsides against the Chinese positions. The Samarang was joined by Modeste, Druid, and Columbine, and together they unleashed hell. Within 10 minutes, the British ships had silenced the Chinese guns, with the exception of 1 or 2, and Scott ordered cutters containing his landing parties to row for the shore and storm the forts. The Chinese remained inside the forts, surrounded by smashed cannons and equipment, and the British Marines and blue-jacketed sailors fought their way in. After taking the forts and 100 prisoners, the Chinese guns were spiked and thrown into the river. The battle ended with a complete British victory. Between 500 and 600 Chinese had been killed, along with 200 to 300 wounded. The British suffered just 38 men wounded. The forts that defended the entrance to the Boca Tigris had been captured, and the way was open for the next phase of the campaign to capture Canton. Tune in next time for Part 2, Harrying the Coast. You have been listening to The Opium Wars, Part 1, Foreign Mud, written and narrated by Dr. Mark Felton. For a wide variety of military history videos, please visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.